welcome to this webinar singing from the same song sheet. I'm reading out because there's a lot of information for me today. It's a webinar about multilateral and local civil society perspectives on the peace in the triple nexus, a very important subject indeed. And I really would like to thank all panelists we have today with us. We have a really remarkable panel, and I will introduce them to you in a minute properly. But first, a very special thank you to Sherry Arnott for the opportunity to discuss the draft paper of the results group 4 of the Interagency Standing Committee, Peace in the Nexus. The paper was just some days ago it was finished. We could share it with the attendees. I'm very, very happy with this opportunity to discuss the draft as it is now. As I understand, the result group is very open for feedback. So that is where all you as attendees come in. Please do participate. The numbers are growing. We are over 70 at the moment. You can share your comments to the chat box. You can enter the chat box via the toolbar down below in your screen. And we will gather all those information and share it later on with Sherry Arnott and other people of the results group. And you can also pose very specific questions. So if you have indeed a question for one of the panelists, please share it with us via the question and answer toolbox, also accessible via the toolbar below your screen. If you share a question, other people can see it and they can vote for it. So that will help us to select those questions people really would like to get more information about. Maybe we have to make a selection. Of course, after the webinar, we can send all panelists the list of questions. And if they are not answered yet, we could ask them to just elaborate on those questions we didn't address during the webinar. If you want to pose a question without your name, anonymously, just tick the box. Then we won't see who is posing the question. Otherwise, we will know who is posing the question. Please start using the chat box now by sharing your name. I see many people already inform us about who they are, where they live, and what organizations they work for. We like to know it very well. And we will offer also the attendees just a limited number of polls, just to get to know you a little bit, but also to get some information about how you feel and how you work with the peace within the nexus. And I think any moment a poll will pop up, and I hope, okay, there it is. I hope you will answer the poll, and later on we will just give feedback to you all about these questions. I think I will present now the speakers of this afternoon. We have 4 very different perspectives on the peace within the nexus. I already mentioned Sherry Arnott. She is not only a member of the results group 4 in the Interagency Steering Committee and co-author of this draft paper, but furthermore, she's Director of Policy Disaster Management of World Vision International. I'm very glad she's here to share the key elements of the draft paper, and it will also be a kickoff for the discussion later with all the other panelists and of course all the attendees. Then we have the perspective of local and national actors. Matt Guy, the national focal point from South Sudan NGO Forum. I'm very glad you're with us, Matt. Matt will reflect on the framing of peace. Where does it overlap and reinforce, or where does it different or hamper each other when you look at the multilateral level of framing the peace or the local and the national level of civil society actors? The next speaker is Martina Zapf. Martina works for Interpeace and is the senior manager of the Interpeace advisory team. And she works in Brussels. She will give us both the perspective of peace builders and the perspective of the EU level. And this will be about complementarity, about connecting different levels to each other, and about implementing peace at these very different levels. And I'm very glad we have also a very independent perspective. Coming from Marzia Montemuro, she's research director of HERE in Geneva, and HERE is an independent think tank on humanitarian policy and practice. And Marzia has been studying the role of different mandates, humanitarian mandates, development mandates, peace building mandates, in these situations of armed conflict for many, many years. I'm very glad we have you as well. Before we go to the first speaker, I want to introduce my co-moderators of today, Ruth Watson of the ACT Alliance EU and Phil Laurenson of the Den Church Aid. They will support me to make this a good webinar. So they will both make sure we address the valid issues and the valid questions that we need to discuss this afternoon. And they will help me, I'm very glad, with checking the chat box and the Q&A box and with these polls. I start with Rudd because I think you are checking the polls, aren't it? Isn't it? Can you give us an update on the poll?
Yeah.
What did we learn about the people?
Okay, so far for the first question on the role in the organisation and which area we're focused on, whether that's peace, humanitarian development, or multi-mandated. So we have about 21% from peace organisations, a larger percentage from humanitarian, actually just 9% from development alone, and then in terms of multi-mandated, those including peace, we have about 20%, and multi-mandated humanitarian development, we have about a quarter of participants. And the second question, where we've asked you, my organisation integrates the goals of the humanitarian development peace nexus at the implementation or project level. Actually, 30% of you have said yes, so a full yes. And then the kind of majority among you are saying more yes than no, and yes, and then 33% have said more no than yes. So there's some spread within that, but quite interesting to start with there. And just to repeat what Peter has said, is thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to an interesting discussion.
Okay, a very diverse group. It's good to have all these experiences with us today. Brett, you've been working very hard the last weeks to make this webinar happening. When are you happy? What would you like to get out of this webinar? What is your key takeaway?
Yeah, so what we were kind of really excited about, given the speakers who are with us today and the participants, I can see your introductions in the chat box. Yeah, it's really good to see the diversity and the range of perspectives we'll have. I think what we're looking for really is some nuance and concrete cases from various contexts to the current discussions around the peace aspect of the nexus, and around some of the theoretical issues about complementarity of actors and joint analysis, and the meaning of peace itself. So we're really looking to highlight the role of local actors and their contribution to building and sustaining peace. And I think that the presentations and the discussions we'll have today will be quite a good step towards that.
Thank you, Red. Free from Den Church, do you have anything to add to this? When are you happy this afternoon?
I think I will be extremely happy to hear what local actors on the ground are doing and their contributions to the peace discussions in the Nexus, because I think that is missing. That's my happiness today.
Okay, thank you, Fee. Good moment, I think, to share also with you that we will make together a short report of this webinar, and we are making a video of it. It will take some days, maybe a week, but as soon as it's there, we share it with all the attendees and the panelists, of course. So that will be shared with you later. I think it's time to go to our first presentation of today. As I said, I'm very pleased we have with us one of the co-authors of the draft paper of the results group of the Interagency Steering Committee, also Director of Policy Disaster Management of World Vision International. Sherry Arnott, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Peter. So I'm going to share my screen. Crossing my fingers, this will work. Okay, I think we're in business. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Good morning for me. I'm here from Canada, and good evening for people we may have joining us from from Asia. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be asked to present on the zero draft of the ISC paper, issues paper on P in the Nexus. So maybe I'll just jump in here. One thing I want to just sort of start with is that this, World Vision is on the core, sorry, excuse me here, I've got this blocked a little bit there, is on the core group of the group that's putting together the paper, but I'm also working very closely with Marco Brutelli from ICFA. So this consultation with NGOs is part of an ongoing consultation that we are are having through the ICFA HDPN working group. If you don't know about it and you'd like to join it, I'm sure Marco would be thrilled, and we can share that link with you. So although I'm representing World Vision here, it really is in collaboration with the ICFA working group, and it's really key we're working closely together to make sure that NGO perspectives and voice are reflected to the extent possible in the ISC paper. So I just wanted to give you a brief background on the history of the paper. So before there was the results group, many of you may probably know that there was an ISC Nexus task team, and this results group is a new iteration. But so there was a history to the kind of decision, a long history for the decision to come up with this issues paper. So it sort of started off with, you know, an analysis paper on where the new ways of working, which was the UN agenda and the sustaining peace agenda, kind of overlapped. You know, a lighter touch issues paper on the nexus and peace agenda, and then the task team end of mandate report suggested that the new iteration, the results group, take up this issue of you know, facilitating a better articulation of the peace in the triple nexus. And then over time, as we can see from the large number of people that have joined this call, there is you know, sort of a lot of interest in you know, where and how and if the peace part would fit into the nexus, or where the peace component would fit into the nexus. So this issues paper, it's not we haven't come up with the final title, but it's a descriptive title, the strengthening the articulation of the P in the triple nexus. So this paper is really wanting to contribute an interagency reflection of what the P in the nexus might look like for a range of humanitarian development actors. I think that is, we're not trying to, I think it's clear, we have to be clear that, you know, it's not trying to be the definitive paper on or the definitive last voice on P in the nexus. It's a contribution to many dialogues that are going on around this. So and as I said, today's dialogue is part of an ongoing effort to ensure a wide range of civil society perspectives are reflected in that document, particularly local actors. Key objectives are to distill the peace concepts for humanitarian and development actors and identify potential entry points along a peace spectrum where humanitarian development actors may not be able to work with peace actors. So I'm going to, you know, just to flag to you, those last two are the two key specific objectives of the paper. And so I'd like you to think about those objectives as you know, from your reading of the paper and also as I go through the presentation. Here you can see the core group leads, and you can see the large number of agencies that are represented in the reference group. I think it just again, to reinforce, you know, that this paper is really filling a gap or responding to a felt need by many agencies to you know, better articulate, better think about, better come to some sort of collective understanding of what peace in the nexus could look like. Then I wanted to give you a little bit of a timeline. So the comments on the zero draft are due by this Friday. So this is, I just wanted to reinforce that your inputs and reflections and feedback on the paper today and before Friday will actually be taken on board and considered. So, you know, sometimes you get papers that are pretty finished and you feel like you know, it's not really at the influence stage. Well, that's not the case in this. It's actually officially open for comments now. And then the next draft will come out July 10th, and then the final draft we're hoping will go to ISC, high-level ISC sign off by the end of July. That's our timelines that we're working with. So this is really the first kick at the can in terms of that zero draft being open and very much encouraging your both comments today, and then I'll describe a little bit, the written comments side of things. We'll also accept written comments, I should say. So objective 1. So we're really looking to distill key peace concepts for humanitarian and development actors. So this is not a primarily a paper geared towards the peace community. A lot of these, some key feedback we've obviously received is from, people who are peace experts. A lot of these concepts are well known and so well known and hotly debated apparently still. But this is, we're trying to do something different. We're trying to help humanitarian actors primarily, but also development actors better understand how and where they might contribute to peace outcomes, and as a concrete way for them to understand how they might work with the peace actors writ large, or not work with them. So as you've seen from the paper, there's sort of 3 the first section of the paper really looks at distilling key peace concepts and how they're and then how they are relevant for a triple nexus approach. So that's the defining feature of this paper. It's, as I said, it's not a paper about peace concepts. It's about how peace concepts can relate to a triple nexus approach. So there's negative positive peace, which is the absence of direct violence versus transformation to a peaceful society. I'm sorry, I've very well, distilled those into sort of simplistic terms. So just, so that will fit onto the slide. So the argument in the paper is that a nexus approach can promote understanding of the roles of different actors, ensure that those actions are mutually reinforcing, and thereby mitigate risk to sustain peace and principled humanitarian actions. So that's where how a nexus approach can help there. I think what's clear, the paper makes very clear, is that we're not talking, does not necessarily imply that these are integration of the 3 nexus pillars. The 3 pillars of the nexus, as a typo there, because we know that is, a critical concern for humanitarian actors in particular. But it can be something like, joined up analysis to help you build your understanding of the context and promote, so a joined up, that's kind of thing. So I think that the key point there is that it's not about, it doesn't necessarily mean that the HDPN doesn't mean that all humanitarian action gets integrated with peace action. So part of our role in this paper is to kind of address some of the key concerns the humanitarian community has around the peace being tagged on to the HD. Then there's little p and big P. So we felt that articulating that conceptually could help humanitarian and development actors better understand where and how they can contribute to peace outcomes through a nexus approach. So I think there are times when humanitarian actors or development actors may just think it's peace writ large. And often peace can be conflated with security actors. So, just articulating the differences and the interlinkages between little p and big P can help, just as a concept that we felt would be really helpful for, non-peace experts to conceptually think about where they might be able to better to engage along a range. And then the positive, short, intermediate versus long-term peace. This is our thinking around, or where we describe in this section is around how, local level peace actions, peace actions and sort of national level peace actions are often talked about as and they are separate approaches, but when they can be mutually reinforcing, they can more effectively address conflict to support peace, sustainable development, and reduced humanitarian need. So it's that interaction. It's not that's important as well. Now, this is a document, and my colleague from the core group, Julius Jackson, is on the call. I don't want to put him on the spot, but I just also want to give him credit for developing this document, the diagram we've got in front. And if we have specific questions on that, Julius, I'm sure you won't mind jumping in to ask or to answer some of those. So the first thing I want to say, so this is the peace spectrum as the paper sort of envisions it. So you know, you've got and I have to caveat this by saying we the writers completely understand that peace, the movement to sustainable peace, is not cyclical, is not linear. But we've struggled with how to represent that visually. So we've had discussions about that, and we've tried to make that clear in the paper. So even though it appears like it's linear, we actually are not envisioning it as linear. So you can see from this paper, from the diagram, we've placed, you know, along the bottom is sort of a, you know, a sort of a minimalist and maximalist approach. So we've got the, you know, at the very basic level, the minimum requirement is a do no harm approach. And then you move along, you know, do no harm, conflict sensitive programming, and then principled human rights approaches. So depending on the context, you maybe have interventions that are you know, addressing one or both or all of those at the same time. But we wanted to be really clear that the foundational to sustaining peace, or underpinning all of our work at minimum should be a do no harm and conflict sensitive and context analysis. So you can see at the bottom there, you've got the humanitarian response building forward that may go up into, you know, it's likely to, the sort of darker color is that you've got them at the very minimum, in many cases, humanitarian response may primarily be focused on do no harm and conflict sensitive approaches, but there may be opportunities, depending on the context, to also start building in principled humanitarian and human rights based approaches, and so on and so forth. You've got development that starts up a little bit higher around conflict sensitive, and then into you know, across the spectrum to you know, to durable peace, and so forth. And then it's sort of the smaller arrows, you know, local dispute resolution, mediation processes, social cohesion, are different types of programming and approaches that are outlined in the paper that move along this spectrum from do no harm, sustaining peace, and contributing to durable peace. So this is our attempt to translate. We've got the concepts, but the concepts then need to be, you know, we wanted to translate those into identifying possible entry points for a variety of nexus actors to contribute to peace outcomes along this spectrum. So with that, I posed a few discussion questions. These are optional, but I would really, you know, so optional in the sense that, you know, any input you want to provide is more than welcome. I think these discussion questions are sort of built around this idea that we've got the zero draft. We realize it's going to need, it's going to get a lot of feedback. It's going to have to be re-edited and rewritten and so forth. So these were some of the discussion questions that we had. Okay, I think that's it, Peter, for me.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Very nice, very good. Really thank you, because it's indeed a very, very, very open call for feedback to all of us. So I hope everybody will take the opportunity to give their feedback. I see in the questions and answers a question to share, a link to download the zero draft. I think Joanna already did it. Thank you, Joanna. So it's in the chat box. I look at the clock also. Just some points I did write down for myself, not to forget. 3 concepts on peace you shared with us: the negative, positive, the little and the big P, short term and long term. All these concepts, I think, should help us to understand our own position and maybe how we can reinforce one each other. So that's, I think it's very helpful concepts to see how we can mutually reinforce all the different interventions. And you shared those different entry points where actors may or may not be able to work together. And one wise lesson: conflict prevention, maybe it will save cost money, but also the need of a thorough context and conflict analysis. And we keep on saying it always, but what I think is very nice, perhaps the opportunity performing joint analysis. Maybe we can come someday that far. I think we move on to the next speaker. There are no open other questions, and I think we can do a round of questions after the second introduction. So thank you very much, Sherry. I think we go to South Sudan, to Matt Guy. Matt, you are the local and national perspective. You give us the national and local perspective from South Sudan, and you are the national focal point of the South Sudan NGO Forum. Please take the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter and Sherry, for the introduction. I have a very bad network reception down here, so I might be off video for a while. I hope that will not hamper the presentation. On this peace context in South Sudan is a very good initiative. I know that the paper is touching a lot on South Sudan. I went through the paper myself. And what we are looking at in South Sudan mostly is that our situation here is mostly lying or touching on negative peace. Why I'm saying this is because the guns are falling silent, but that's largely due to the pressures from the religious.
I'm afraid we did lose you, Matt. Are you still with us?
Sorry, I dropped off the network because.
Please continue.
Hello?
We just missed
the last
30 seconds. So continue, please.
Yeah, sorry, I dropped off the network. It was very bad. So basically, quickly, the context in South Sudan is on negative peace. The guns are falling silent, but of course, it's largely due to the pressures from international community, religious leaders, and traditional leaders, and of course, regional bodies like the IGAD. But these are resulted, of course, to the revitalized peace agreement that was signed the other day, the formation of the transitional government of national unity. And of course, there still remains some bits and pieces here and there, but I think the country is getting there. Only thing that we are very worried about right now is the formation of, or the appointment of state governors, which is really causing a lot of problem in those kind of situations. There are a lot of intercommunity violence that has been going on for the reason to about 415 cases of incidences. And so this one is going to be a threat, of course, to the ongoing peace that the country is enjoying and the implementation of the life peace agreement. But of course, we need in South Sudan, so we can be able to go ahead. We need positive peace. And with positive peace, we need to have some few streams of engagement. Firstly is we have to rebuild law and order in the country, and whereby we need to ensure people can really move freely and safely across the country. And this can ensure freedom of speech and even encourage citizens' engagement and, of course, public accountability. Secondly, we need to look at the rebuilding of communities through reconstruction and construction of schools, health facilities, water access points, and the rebuilding of local livelihood and opportunities. My third point is about the revitalization of the economy, whereby we need to reconstruct local markets, try and build community access roads for farmers and individuals that like to be able to access these markets and resources, interact with each other. Fourthly, we need to have sound systems and procedures for revenue mobilization from both oil and non-oil sector. South Sudan is largely seen as a country, or is largely a country that actually depends on oil. And of course, with the COVID-19 and all the economic problems that brought by, we need to see how we can be able to actually diversify our economy and look at how agriculture and livestock can be used to bring economy up and running. And then we need to expand and systemize our revenue base, which is a process whereby public funds can be collected and can be communicated to citizens to enhance transparency and accountability. And the lastly, of course, is the peace building and reconciliation through education, memorials at local levels, peace committees, and formation and resolve local conflict. Basically, this is bringing in the little p of what the national NGOs largely are doing in the country and how they're engaging with the local authorities to be able to extend or expand the peace processes on the ground level. We have a couple of peace actors in South Sudan. Firstly, of course, are the political leaders who need to create the political will and as duty bearers, they need to enforce, of course, rule of law by retraining, of course, the police and security forces, organized forces. They provide resources that are used for provision of social services that are largely being done right now by NGOs and international NGOs alike. And of course, to put in place policies that incentivize local entrepreneurs as well as build investors' confidence. As South Sudan, of course, remains rich in natural resources, but we have not yet explored all this. Probably exploring this kind of options might be able to bring a lasting peace and, of course, people to settle back into their livelihoods and build their livelihoods. Another aspect of duty bearers are citizens. Of course, as citizens, we need to begin to trust and engage with our leaders by asking them, what are you doing for our country? And basically, in terms of the populations and improving the lives and conditions of populations. Many South Sudanese, of course, need access to basic services, which remain largely provided by NGOs, as I had stated before. NGOs alike are actors of peace, as they not only provide basic services to support, but also support engagement between citizens and their leaders, either nationally or at the subnational level. The engagement is very important so as we can be able to hold our leaders accountable for the services they're providing and maybe start become responsive to enable them to start becoming responsive to the needs of local communities. On the religious leader side, the peace actors here, who are the churches, have been largely seen to be the cohesive aspect, especially during the discussions that were ongoing about the conflict. They were the people who actually brought the warring parties to the table, although there's many a times that the discussions collapsed. But the respect that peace that the church has in South Sudan is quite big and cannot be left unnoticed, which has actually brought and has played a major role in brokering the peace that we are in now. And of course, when it comes to the NGOs and the largely national NGOs, of course, in armed conflict are increasingly being seen as actors who can be able to actually reach and deliver aid. Large international NGOs have used this kind of code because the reach that they have into these locations, the contextual knowledge and advantage that they have, the niche that they have in terms of discussions that go on ground has been able to put them in a comparative advantage to be able to respond to the needs of the people. This one has been seen as been evident in the fact that the number of national NGOs that have included in the country-based pool for the South Sudan Humanitarian Response Plan since 2016 has risen from 40 in 2016 to now 143. This is like more than 70% increase of funding going to national NGOs, and probably mostly is because of the reasons that I just gave above. And the proliferation of the South Sudan NGOs has increasingly as the central role in the humanitarian response and has been driven by the access constraints and the risk associated with operating in the country. International NGOs, of course, are dependent on the NGOs to reach conflict-affected communities. And an area which we see that the national NGOs can really grow is because when they're doing the implementation, there is very thin line between a professional thin line between them as family members and the community members and how they relate nationally to the conflict. And so what the NGO Forum can do and what we do as the NGO Forum is to try and remove this non-partisanship by encouraging our national NGOs to, of course, recruit international staff who can be able to implement programming, encourage them or even support the formulation of policies that are going to enhance accountability. This is HR, finance, sexual exploitation, abuse, and we are able to hold them into account, and they're actually auditable, that these NGOs are able to work on the ground. And another thing is that we conduct training on humanitarian principles regularly, and how they are upheld in this kind of situations, and conflict sensitivity as part of that training. What peace looks like in South Sudan in terms of in the triple nexus is that what we think that can happen is that we need to have political will from our national leaders to take interest of the citizens of the peace in their decision making, policy formulation, and public speeches. This one will bring development of the nation building that comes with a peaceful environment that we think that leaders can be able to champion as the first duty bearers. Secondly, we need to rebuild the communities. We know that many schools, churches, and access points were destroyed during the war. And once having these resources up and running, we'll be able to gain confidence and even encourage a meaningful return of the nationals who had actually left the country and as refugees and are able to come back and build their livelihoods. Other thing, of course, that runs concurrently with the rebuilding communities is the peace building and reconciliation, which is key and paramount to be able to bring lasting peace, not only to avoid the negative peace that we are seeing, but of course to bring in the positive peace, in which that the peace can be long-lasting and can be held in by the nationals of the country themselves. And of course, lastly, is to revitalize the economies. And that one is by giving, of course, tax incentives for businesses and to encourage businesses to grow, and rebuilding of the markets that were there before. And how do you achieve this through the national NGOs? Many national and international actors have adopted integrated programming that assume peace as a prerequisite. Peace also requires that all actors take risks in trusting and promoting confidence and trust in one another. This requires local leadership and international leaders to work in concert with one another. For this to be done, of course, there'll be requirement of multi-year and flexible fund national NGOs. This can be channeled to largely on the country-based pool funds that is really working very well in South Sudan and even going in line with the ground again. But of course, we really need more to be done by the international community. And this one can be done by actually adding more funding to the country-based pool fund that supports national NGO and actually are easier for national NGO to be able to access. Statistically speaking, the amount of funding that comes to South Sudan, only 5% is covered by the CBPF pool funds. And probably if this is increased, the reach and the footprint of the national NGOs can be able to be enhanced and highlighted. We need to take risks. We know that the programming on orientation capacity of national NGOs is not being built because of the humanitarian kind of implementation, but if this kind of implementation is actually reviewed and we have the triple nexus adopted into this type of programming, it can be easier for these national actors to be able to have a footing when the international actors have actually left the country and be able to take the country ahead. Finally, of course, there's opportunities for meaningful partnership or consortia, be it national to national or national to international, whereby the actors, or the local actors rather, can be able to be seen as equitable partners and able to bring their specific expertise on the table, such as peace work and capacity sharing spaces that build upon complementarities rather than subcontracting in order to implement peace within this triple nexus programming spectrum. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm very sorry for the IT issues that are really hampering us down here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much. And I'm very glad we had your perspective. It's an important perspective in this whole debate. And thank you for drawing our attention to the growing role of local and national actors and their growing relevance. And of course, the strong plea for building a more robust capacity of local and national NGOs, for instance, by pooled funds. You were sketching the movement from negative peace as it is now in South Sudan, that people are a bit fatigued of war tired. And there is a kind of political leadership vacuum towards a positive peace, streaming towards positive peace, a difficult process. And you mentioned things like rebuilding law and order, rebuilding communities, revitalizing the economy, public accountability, all very difficult aspects and all touching upon different aspects of peace building, development, and humanitarian action. I think we had a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and we had a lot of comments in the chat box. Maybe it's time to check with Ruud. I hope Ruud is ready for it. Could you perhaps give us an update of what is going on in the chat box and in the Q&A box? I don't know whether Ruud is there.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, your voice is loud and clear now. Ruud, what can you share with us? What is happening?
Yeah, great. So we had a couple of comments from Jeff Andrews, who had a conversation quickly with Martina Zapf about the incentives and disincentives for peace and peace programming. So Jeff raised a kind of concrete case of where in one country, UN peacekeepers were motivated to not address security because peace meant loss of hardship allowance and loss of jobs. For other UN humanitarian actors, they wanted to exaggerate insecurity because if too peaceful, they would lose their hardship allowance. So there's a kind of pretty complex question there around incentives and disincentives, which I think would be interesting to discuss further with Martina there. There's questions on the paper as well. There's comments from Tobias Zee. Would you like to come in there, Tobias, to raise your comment?
Would you like to, Tobias, to elaborate on this comment? Sorry, Ruud, what would you propose?
Yeah, so Tobias has raised a couple of comments about the paper and specific issues around some of the terminology. So social cohesion kind of being directly connected or equal to peace programming, but this being a kind of, so if I read what he said, I think this is a rather abstract impact on society, potentially resulting from various outcomes on humanitarian development and peace work. As such, it's extremely difficult to measure. And in addition, there's a risk of misconceptualization. So that's a kind of thought for reflection there. Yeah,
I can add Tobias to the panel and allow him to talk.
Yeah.
I'll just do it and we see what happens. Tobias, are you with us?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but only very, very softly. Please, can you put up your volume?
Well, maybe it works now.
Oh, I think it's very soft. No, this won't work, I'm afraid.
Okay. In which
we have
case,
one question we could put forward to Matt and one question we could put forward to Sherry and then move on to the next speaker.
Yep. So from Inga Brees from CARE, we have a question around what do you expect, Sherry, for the IASC paper to change? Once approved, how is this supposed to be put into practice? And is every organization then kind of aiming to do their own reflection, or will there be a kind of change in structures at global or country level?
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks, Inga. That's a big question. So let me just touch on this is very much an issues paper to help articulate concepts and start building some shared language around what peace in the nexus could look like. We deliberately did not do a guidance paper because we felt like there was too much uncertainty and often concern around peace in the nexus. So, so what is it expected to change? I mean, the ISC is a normative group, so it doesn't drive operational change. I mean, sorry, the ISC results group, I should say the ISC does, but the results group, is normative. So it's about building language and shared language and moving moving understanding forward. So in short, it's, yeah, I would say I don't see it in the short term or even there being, you know, it driving any change in structures at the global or country level. I think there's, you know, it's kind of like the, you know, the humanitarian development nexus itself has been around for, you know, 30 or 40 years, and we're, you know, we're taking it, you know, we're taking it along a journey so that it's actually driving, some, you know, we're actually starting to see more action on it on the ground. So I don't know, that really doesn't answer it. I would say no, it's not, it is an issues paper, and it was deliberately described as an issues paper, just to start building some general, you know, some you know, collective understanding of what peace in the nexus could mean.
Okay, and then there's been a few questions which kind of challenge a bit gaps in the paper on the reasons for reluctance by humanitarian actors to engage on peace. So in the question of, particularly raised is the question of neutrality, and I've actually kind of started one of the polls questions for everyone to participate in, where we're asking you where are you currently contributing to peace, and later we'll ask about what your concerns are and the reluctance there. So Sherry, do you have any thoughts on that side?
Sorry, Ruth, which question are you?
Yeah,
I'm trying to get through them. Yeah. So.
Yeah, so there's a couple. So there's one from Sylvia asking about security. So the third pillar is often referred to as security rather than peace. And this is something that the paper should address directly as a major barrier currently. And then we have another question around whether the paper can go into more depth around, so at the top there, around whether the paper can go into more depth around addressing the difficulty to engage for humanitarian actors in fragile and difficult contexts.
Mm-hmm. So I would say, yes. So Sylvia, yes, I think the paper does delve into this. We've deliberately chosen the sustaining peace agenda because that is the, you know, rather than security, but we do talk, obviously touch on security actors in the paper, but we'll take the point, you know, because it's a comment, it's a feedback on the paper that should be addressed more directly in the paper. So thank you for that. So my action is, yes, we will take that comment and include it in the feedback on the paper. It's a complicated area, as you said. And then the second one was from who, Ruth? Sorry. I'm trying to go back and forth here.
Yeah, so from Miro Modruson.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Yes, this is, I mean, the concepts were a bit confusing. So yes, we have, I will take that as feedback, and we've gotten that feedback a little bit as well, just to make clear the terms. Yes, actually, that's an interesting point about the concerns by humanitarians, not the actual reasons behind that. So one of the comments that we received from OCHA on the reference group is that the paper probably needs to be just, like, it's the elephant in the room. I actually had a slide that I was calling the elephant in the room about really like acknowledging the concerns, the very obvious concerns based on various experiences of the humanitarians, and how that would be a barrier or could cause challenges. And I think that clearly, you know, it needs to come out more strongly in the paper. And thank you. So we'll take that. We'll take your comment into our into the feedback. But yes, acknowledging, yes, this is really a big issue, and as an ISC paper, it needs to reflect that more clearly.
Thank you so much, Sherry. And I'm very sorry to hear the elephant didn't make it to our PowerPoint this afternoon. and thank
I thought
you,
it might be a very specific specific kind of North American sort of idiom. So I.
No problem. Thank you, Ruth, for giving us the summary and sharing the questions. I think the system with the thumbs up works well because some questions get higher on the list than other questions. I think we have to move on to the other speakers we have for this afternoon. The next speaker will be Martina Zapp. She's Senior Manager of the Interpeace Advisory Team, giving both the perspective of the peace working and of the EU level. Martina, please, can you come in? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining this discussion. There have already been very interesting questions and comments. I first want to just say that this webinar is meant to be about local perspectives. I'm obviously not a local actor, and I also don't represent a local actor. Interpeace works in country in partnership with local actors, and we've also done some in-depth work on questions around the nexus, researching local experiences. So as much as possible, I will try to refer to and to share things that I have directly heard from local actors. But I think particularly as the current global protests call our renewed attention to issues of racism, discrimination, and inequality, and power differences, we, I think, still have to do a lot better to engage directly with local actors, hear from them and empower them. And it's great that we had Matt from South Sudan and heard from him, and hearing the voices from the South Sudan NGO actors. And this brings me directly to my first point with regards to the paper, which is around localization. I think the localization agenda has very much run in parallel to the Nexus agenda, and they actually need to connect a bit more in my view. And I think that that's an aspect in the paper that could be strengthened. In my view, the Nexus requires us all to deliver on the promise of localization, which has not sufficiently been realized since the World Humanitarian Summit and its promises in 2016. And at the same time, delivering on localization is probably also a way to deliver on the Nexus. So in a sense, they're mutually reinforcing, and I'll explain why I think that. When we researched local perspectives in 3 contexts in 2015 and 16 in Cote d'Ivoire, the DRC, and in Palestine, what we heard repeatedly from local actors is that they felt treated like mere executing agents. So projects and programs, once they engage local actors, are already very well defined, and they're not evolved enough in the stage of conflict analysis and the stage of making decisions on programming. So the paper already suggests and highlights the importance of conflict and context analysis. On the one hand, that they should be joined up, but that puts a bit too much focus for me on the international actors. The more important emphasis for me, and that's also in the paper, is that conflict and context analysis should be participatory and inclusive. And that puts much more emphasis on local leadership in determining how programs get informed and get shaped. Because for local actors, I think the closer we go to the field level, the more those silos of humanitarian development and peace become obsolete, because they're all very interconnected. The closer you go to local realities and to the experiences of the people in need. My second point is that there's a clear need to demystify the piece in the nexus. And I think the paper responds to that need very much by outlining the different ways of understanding and conceptualizing peace and contributions to peace. And I think that's a really important step to address some of the sensitivities and the very valid and understandable concerns of the humanitarian community in particular. About the potentially too political or also too securitized nature of working on the P. I want to highlight 2 aspects that are also featured in the paper. The first one is the importance of the points on positive peace, resilience, and prevention. It's important to understand that strengthening peace is not only about fixing what is broken, but it's also about strengthening, identifying and then strengthening what already exists that supports peace. So identifying what elements in societies bind people together and strengthening that and using that for transformation. And you can find that in any society, no matter how badly it's affected by conflict. We conducted, for example, peace mapping in Libya a few years ago and identified factors that have enabled some communities to stay more peaceful than others. And we're trying to strengthen those aspects and build on those. The second thing I want to emphasize in this regard is that it's not only about the what, but it's also, and maybe more importantly, about the how. So contributing to peace is not only about what you do, it's about adding in specific activities that address different peace and conflict issues. But building peace is also about an approach and a lens. It's also a way of engaging. And if you understand the P and the nexus in that way, and I think that's maybe an aspect to add in the paper, I think that really demystifies what contributing to peace requires and how accessible such contributions are and how realistic they are to make for humanitarian actors. Because it doesn't necessarily require to change that much what humanitarian development actors do, but maybe more how they do it, how you integrate longer term issues into shorter term approaches, laying the foundations and contributing to longer term resilience and sustainable peace. Paying attention to issues, for example, about relationships between groups, relationships between authorities and people, but also about the inclusion and exclusion of different groups. For example, recently we worked with a UN agency in Lebanon and saw a project that was strengthening water infrastructure, water availability. And they very importantly worked with host communities and refugee communities. And therefore, we're not only conflict sensitive, but actually contributed to improving the relationships between these groups. My third overarching point is that we've been talking about these issues for several years now and recognized, I think widely recognized, this need to work more in a nexus-oriented way, to strengthen contributions to peace in humanitarian and development assistance, and to work in more integrated ways. And we've made some progress, but there's still a lot to do. And the question is, why haven't we advanced further on these issues? And I think we do need to ask ourselves that question. And for me, the important thing is to understand and to recognize that it requires changes to the way our organizations work. It requires changes in our organizational systems, in our processes, in our capacities, in order to enable such ways of working. And to scale up the many good examples that do already exist, but to learn from them, to collect evidence, that's another thing I think that we're very much missing. And that was a question that was posed in the Q&A. How do we actually know what works and what doesn't? We have anecdotal evidence and we have a lot of examples, but it's true that it's not systematized enough. Maybe to cite one example, we've been working for a number of years with the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and they've certainly made great strides in putting institutional commitments in place and then systematically embedding different ways of working in their organizational systems and processes for project design, now tackling M&E and so on. So really integrating this different way of working in the organization. And that's, I think, really key to make a lasting change. And lastly, I want to comment on the role of multilateral organizations like the EU and also member state governments, both in their capacities as policy setters and also as donors, because they obviously very much act as both. And I want to give further emphasis to a few points that the paper already raises. So on the one hand, there's this need for greater clarity on which is the very issue that the paper is trying to address, greater clarity on what we mean by the P in the nexus, in order to precisely, and that's come up in one of the comments in the Q&A as well, in order to avoid misunderstandings and in order to lower the rightful resistance in some parts of the humanitarian community, by, for example, clarifying that the P in the nexus is not about security, at least not the way we understand it, and I think the way the majority of actors understand it. So on the one hand, there's this policy setting and creating greater clarity, and on the other hand, the other important role that donors and countries have is to change the incentive structures that govern our whole sector and our whole system. We had that also in the Q&A a little bit. Because donors, of course, multilateral actors have an important role to play to set incentives to either require minimalist approaches, as the paper outlines, so at a minimum do no harm in being conflict sensitive, or even to encourage and incentivize more maximalist approaches, requiring actors and holding them accountable to how they're contributing to sustaining peace. and addressing even potentially drivers of conflict where such opportunities exist. The paper also already highlights the importance of collective outcomes, and I think that's another important aspect to working more in a nexus-oriented way that donors can further incentivize, requiring the articulation and the contribution to collective outcomes in order to work towards more systemic transformation across the humanitarian development and peace pillars. So the collective outcomes is another point. And then my last point with regard to donors and multilateral agencies is that nexus-oriented ways of working require a great deal of flexibility from donors. And I think also there we've seen some changes, but there's also still a long way to go. We did some research actually with humanitarian actors last year, where we also heard from some actors, well, particularly multi-mandated INGOs, for whom it's very intuitive to, at the very least, work at the interface between humanitarian and development action, but also to some extent peace action. But very often, when you then try and fit projects into different funding channels, it doesn't work, because then one donor will tell you, well, this is development, we only fund humanitarian, or another donor tells you, well, we fund peace work, but you're humanitarian agencies, you're not eligible to apply. So there's a lot of change, I think, that could be considered at a donor level in terms of creating greater flexibility in line with a nexus-oriented way of working, both in terms of funding mechanisms and also in terms of how they're enabling adaptive programming throughout, because working in a conflict-sensitive way, and ideally in a way that contributes to peace, requires ongoing monitoring of the context, engagement with local actors, and therefore ongoing adaptations to programming. And that needs to be possible in the framework of programs and grants and funding mechanisms. So I'll stop there for now, and I'll look forward to engaging more with the audience on Q&A.
Thank you so much, Martina. Very broad perspective, very rich contribution. I just wrote down some key points for myself. The link between localization and the nexus, very good. You bring those two together. Please use what we already do or what already is within a society. Perhaps it's not so much about what we do, but how we do. I think there's a nice connection to the next speaker, Mazia. I think she will touch upon the why. So then we have had the what, the how, and the why. And please understand the way your organization works and what does work. Make clear what methods, what interventions were effective, and understand it. And a lot of more elements you shared with us. I think we first go further with the next speaker, and then we go back to Ruud to get a feedback from the chat box, because there's a lot of things going on in the chat box and all kinds of questions that are posed to us. Mazia. You're Mazia Montemero from the research special from here in Geneva. You've been many years researching the fields where humanitarian development and peace workers come together, always in those conflict settings. Please, could you reflect on the draft paper and on the discussions we had so far? The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. And first of all, thank you to the KUNO Platform, the ACT Alliance, and Venturate for organizing such a rich discussion and an opportunity to reflect on the paper. And it's so great to see that there is such a diverse audience already. So I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. As you mentioned, Peter, yes, I would like to use the research that we have been conducting mostly in four contexts: Central African Republic, Mali, Ethiopia, and Myanmar for the past 3 years with 8 humanitarian organizations, to maybe bring 4 sets of considerations that I hope can be helpful in the finalization of the paper. Some of the points have also already been raised to some extent. I think the first one is very much to pick up on Martina's point and on the main theme of the webinar this afternoon, is this idea of local actors. And I think the question that is coming to me, and that's something that we have seen through our research in the past few years, is the notion of are we all really equal partners? I think if we want to go back to the World Humanitarian Summit, one of the big achievements that I saw was the acknowledgement that we all work in an ecosystem. And I think the greatest implication of this shift from system to ecosystem was the fact that it acknowledges that you have a variety of different actors and they all contribute differently, but on an equal footing. And so in this case, local actors are definitely on an equal footing as everybody else, UN agencies, INGOs. What we have noticed moving forward afterwards on the discussions, especially at the global level on the humanitarian development and peace nexus, is that by default, and maybe by use of reference, because there was also an internal UN reform process, there's been a bit of a shift back into looking at the humanitarian realm as a system, so a more top-down approach. And I think so one element that I would like to go forward is to not lose track of the fact that we are indeed working in an ecosystem, and that's where also it's also easier than to see the different components, be it humanitarian, peace, or development. The second element that I think working with 8 different organizations has brought to our attention is the general need for nuancing. So I think if we look at it from the nexus, and picking up also on my first point, is to see that if we want a nexus to really be truly and effectively operationalized, I think we need to be careful about taking a shortcut and referring to each grouping as a monolithic grouping of actors. And as such, humanitarian actors, it may be silly a bit to highlight, but this is something that came out very strongly from our research. They're not all the same, even in terms of what the goal of humanitarian action is seen, of maybe what some of the basic terminology is interpreted, or how the humanitarian principles are operationalized. It leads to a variety of different approaches. And so picking up on Martina's point in terms of it's important not to look only at the what, which I think the paper is really helpful in trying to highlight the different understandings of the spectrum of peace program activities, but it's also to look at the why. So why organizations are engaging in specific contexts. For example, from a humanitarian perspective, we saw that it may be, first priority, alleviate suffering, save lives, but you may also have this concept of dignity that it's not present everywhere and may be interpreted in very different ways. But it has a very specific implication then in terms of whatever an organization's role may see for itself and towards contribution to longer term development or peace outcomes. And I think in this context, I would also argue that it would be interesting then maybe for the paper to see to what extent you have contributions for the different actors, both to the small p and the big P. So that it's both in terms of community-based organizations to local actors, who they may be, from local NGOs to local authorities, up to national actors, and then all of the rest of the spectrum. The third element that I think was already being tapped a little bit in some of the Q&A discussions is this, I think, important element for me to distinguish between doing things right versus doing the right thing. So it was really interesting to see in the paper indeed the reference to conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity programming as an opportunity also to do more joined up analysis across the different spectrum of the nexus. But I think if we look at it, if we look at the nexus from a perspective of an internal approach that an organization can have, it's a bit what Marc Dubois in the recent webinar with the Center for Humanitarian Action in Berlin suggested as the nexus thinking, then in a way conflict analysis and conflict sensitivity is basically an articulation of a do no harm framework for every organization. And as such, for example, in our recent research in Ethiopia, where most of the organizations were focused on resilience building or humanitarian work linked to food security crisis, but not necessarily conflict-induced displacement. With the sudden rise in people displaced by conflict, there was an acknowledgement that organizations were not ready. And one of the elements that organizations internally recognized was that they were not ready because they hadn't necessarily done the proper analysis from a conflict perspective and and integrated conflict sensitivity into their programming as well. So I think that's very much in terms of also doing things right. So again, going back to the what in terms of the programming. But if you want to go back to the how and why organizations engage in a certain context, I think it's very much where it's what gives really the opportunities to highlight complementarities and comparative advantages as the nexus tries to put forward. So just to give an example, and I've noted, for example, the use in the paper, both, which was quite interesting, the reference to the principles, but also the reference to a concept which is that of equity. And I wanted to highlight how, if we look at this idea of the why and the how, we need to be careful about understanding the interaction between the two, so that we see where each organization may be coming from. So, for example, we did research in the Central African Republic. There was a recent peace agreement in 2019. And of course, the peace agreement also details a number of steps that will be helpful for the international community to support, and also for some of the national and local actors. Naturally, one of the priority groups is former combatants as a specific element to support continued peace in the future. And some of the programs that were highlighted were, of course, identifying that as a priority group together with the communities where they live. Now, that's of course around equitably supporting these two groups. If we come in from a humanitarian perspective, we would have the principle of impartiality that is used first and foremost. And so the idea of non-discrimination, but also the idea of must need. Of course, there may be an overlap in terms of the two groupings, but the humanitarian perspective would be not to start from a specific group first, or at least that shouldn't be the idea. And so if we look at back the how and the why, we may see, for example, where there are opportunities for interlinkages based on different conceptual starting points, and where are the potential risks for tension. And I think for me, that brings me to my last point, which is very much around maybe reframing opportunities and risks. So what I've seen in talking with staff from the different organizations that we worked with in the past 4 years is the idea that there seems to be quite a bit of focus in terms of what the humanitarian actors can do, both to sustain longer term outcomes, whether they're humanitarian development, or contribute to peace outcomes as well. And I think we need to be careful in terms of using that language. If I think of, for example, of the Grand Bargain and the idea also of the nexus to some extent, it was this opportunity to rethink the burden of humanitarian actors, especially as crises become more and more protracted, and reevaluate then how to better make the linkages between humanitarian development and peace. Now, the question is, it may be helpful and it may be an opportunity with this paper to reframe the discussion as well. So, and I saw that in the paper, it's already highlighted a little bit in terms of, for example, ceasefire negotiations, supporting the opening of specific humanitarian corridors or supporting humanitarian space. But I think it would be great to see to what extent we can reframe that discussion in terms of not only what, and I think I would be careful to say what humanitarian actors can do to support peace outcomes, but rather seeing how can, how do humanitarian actors fit within the overall understanding of what the context requires, but also see what are the opportunities that can be used to leverage each and everyone's positioning to, for example, also continue supporting and preserve humanitarian space. And this, for example, also leads me back to an element that I've seen largely missing from the nexus, but which I think is important coming also from a humanitarian perspective, because we don't focus only on assistance, but we will also focus on protection. And it's very much the lack of the presence of human rights actors. So just to conclude with an example of Myanmar, where you have a context where there are serious human rights violations, and you have to, humanitarian actors, but also generally international and local actors have to engage and have to define what really, how do they manage their relationship with the state. I think it's important to have that discussion generally, and I think that's where the nexus can help. So really look at the comparative advantages. So to see who has the best positioned in terms of negotiating and leveraging their relationship with a specific aspect of the state, whether it be at the local level or at the national level, to protect the work that, for example, humanitarian actors are doing. It could be local actors, it can be international actors, it could be in terms of partnerships. But I think I would see that as a helpful also push towards reframing some of the discussion and potentially also bringing humanitarian actors more effectively within the conversation around the peace. But while addressing also some of the concerns and demystifying a bit some of what the big P may be about. I'm going to stop here, but I'm very much looking forward to some of the discussion afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Thank you very much. And still, there are many questions coming along, and the chat box is floating very well. You highlighted many issues, but be careful about the framing. How can we be complementary? How can we make sure the humanitarians are approached in a proper way so that they feel it's about how they can fit well into those nexus activities and not need to be part of it or something like that, I think. You stress also the issue of localization. I think the equal footing of the ecosystem maybe connects a little bit to what Martina also shared with us on localization and nexus. There is a connection between the two. Please be careful about acknowledge the variety, the difference between all those groups working in all those different fields, whether it's humanitarian or development or peace building. There are many issues you stressed upon. Brett, I just checked with you because I think it's fair first to check with Sherry, to ask her reflections on the last two contributions, and then perhaps to check the questions and answers box if there's still some open questions. I think we have some 10 to 15 minutes left, so we surely should go to a conclusion. Brett, what do you think? Shall we first go to Sherry and then go then check some questions from the chat box?
Yeah, although Sherry, there's one question which I can add to the comments, which I think is kind of complementary to what's been just said. So from Ralph Sudoff, he's questioned as a bit on the so it's key to clarify the definitions as we talked about before, but really as you've presented this kind of spectrum of different peace actions, Ralph has made the comment, if actors, for example, define all kinds of education, economic, youth employment programs as peace related, it might get challenging to judge if and where the P in the nexus should be substantially operationalized. And when we are rather seeing a relabeling of existing programs and same practices as in the past. So yeah, it'd be good to hear your thoughts on the peace spectrum that you've presented in the paper alongside your reflections.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. Yeah, I think that is definitely a a concern or an issue. So it, what I think helping to use our, the sustaining peace agenda and grounding it in that helps to set a few parameters around that. I mean, what we've said in the paper is that, peace programming in the Nexus would be related to programs that have an explicit objective to contribute to peace. So not just an objective, but also demonstrate that contribution to peace. Although, so I think we will definitely take that on. I think in some ways, when I was listening to Matt's presentation, it was the it was challenging some of the more narrow definitions of peace. And one thing that did come out in reflections back from the reference group on the paper was, that the issue of kind of social service delivery as a contributor to peace, and I think we think of it in terms, on the fragility side anyways, in terms of contributing to state citizen trust building, decent social or good social service, equitable, inclusive social service delivery as a contributor to, to that relationship. So, I think it's a really important point, and I think we'll, as the core group, we can take that in and think about how to make sure that some of those parameters around what the peace, what the P is. I mean, that's clearly a development intervention, and education and emergencies is humanitarian. I mean, conceptually, conceptually we separate these things conceptually, but then, Martina's comment about, like the closer you get to, affected communities, affected households, the more that those silos fall apart. And that was certainly something we heard echoed in the ICFA consultation on the Nexus a few years ago, was, when you talk to local organizations, they repeatedly said, look, it's the same, like, it's one person who may be experiencing a humanitarian development and peace crisis all at the same, or the impacts of those various things all at the same time, but it's a single person, and it's just our system that kind of divides those up. So I thought that was a really important and important reflection from Martina's presentation. And I think this idea of, localization as a way to, sort of get to the nexus. I mean, that ties in very well with Matt's, looking at the issue as holistically at the, as a local NGO, of, the interplay between political will, economic recovery, law and order, rule of law, and so forth. And there's sort of multiple things that people, that need to happen at the national level, and the contribution that local NGOs and the very helpful kind of reflections on how local NGOs and INGOs can be mutually reinforcing is really important. Lots of great inputs. I mean, I've got a massive amount of kind of reflections here from people, really helpful reflections. I need to take those in and then digest them, and then, go back to the core group with this. But I find that overall, and then Marzia's comments around, like this, talking about opportunities and risks. I think we do touch on quite a few of those in the paper, but I think we just as a kind of industry, we tend to not talk about opportunities quite enough. So I think we'll, you know, like my kind of take home from that, Mazia, one of my takeaways is to kind of look at as we're looking at the paper, to think about, you know, are we presenting enough about the opportunities, and are we also presenting enough about potential risks? You know, because if we're helping, if the point of the paper is to help, you know, people in organizations reflect on how they might, you know, better contribute to peace and where may be the entry points. I mean, you know, outlining both the opportunities and risks coherently. Some of them, the major ones, we can't do all of them because it's so context specific. And again, Marcia, your point about nuancing, and that humanitarian development and peace actors are not a monolith, either within the sector or within each of the pillars and across, is a really important point. Hard to catch that kind of nuance in a global paper. But I think, you know, that issue of, we sort of try to capture it with the, you know, respective mandates and, you know, comparative advantages and so forth. But sometimes that, you know, becomes a little bit too much of a generic language. And I think just to close, I mean, this has been incredibly helpful, you know, for me, and also, you know, very informative. I think this is an opportunity to do a real kind of reality check against, you know, that balance you try to strike between a global paper, but making sure it is reflective of a wide range of perspectives, a wide range of experience, and it doesn't get too much into the stratosphere. I mean, overall, I got a sense, and I hope I've interpreted this correctly, that people feel that it's something that is needed and can be very useful as a basis to kind of build a dialogue around, not a dialogue, but a dialogue around getting to a shared understanding. Maybe not consensus is not the right word, but I mean, just, you know, continuing to build this, you know, understanding of these, you know, peace, and address some of the harder questions and harder concerns head on. And I think that's an important role that this paper can take, you know, can facilitate that. I think I'll leave it there.
Yes, thank you, Sherry. Thank you very much. And we have, I think, 4 minutes left. Maybe we can a little bit go over the time, because I really would like to hear some last reflections of Matt Guy and perhaps also the other speakers. Red, I just want to check with you. Is there one question we really need to put forward to the panelists in this final round?
Yeah, so I'd like to bring in Fee Lauritsen, who has a question for Matt Guy and the final speakers.
Thanks, Ruth. This is Fee from GCA. I just picked up on Matt's from the NGO forum in South Sudan, talking about you know, institutional capacity strengthening of national local actors and really reinforcing the complementarities. And I just last week a very big report came from the ODI Humanitarian Policy Group, building from the ground up, and basically was saying we as INGOs and the international community don't really value the contextual capacities that national and local NGOs have. We have a too strong focus on technical rather than contextual capacities, and it really strikes me. And so, Matt, I would be very interested to hear what type of institutional capacity strengthening initiatives do you see is required for national local actors to really be more at the center of the peace nexus dialogue globally, but of course also in South Sudan? Over.
Hello.
Yes, Matt, we can hear you loud and clear. Please proceed.
Yes, thank you very much, Fee, and thank you all panelists for the conversations I've gone. I think from our perspective, largely, as Fee said it rightly, national NGOs are the first responders, and half the time we are used as humanitarian actors. Most of the funding goes to technical capacity and, of course, just putting out the fire, but largely leaves us vulnerable as national NGOs, because at the end of the day, you need to have institutional capacity built in terms of your own system strengthening, in terms of board governance, in terms of finance, in terms of HR, logistics, and all this. Because it's not enough to just create policies and maybe implement them, but who is going to implement them when everybody leaves? Because national NGOs becoming actually susceptible to staff itself is a problem, because if I am to get employment from an international NGO or donor agency, which has much more longer term funding mechanisms than a national NGO, and you are doing bulk of the work, it becomes quite absurd that the capacity of national NGOs is not built in the process of all this kind of humanitarian programming that is going on. And South Sudan is one of the few countries that is very well funded in terms of donor funding of recent, because of the conflict largely. But if that's the case, we need to look at how this can be leveraged with the South Sudanese population. We know that we have got a lot of experience and knowledge with working with international NGOs, all the trainings that have gone into the country, all the capacity building that has gone there. But once they leave, it dies off that angle. And we think that by having continuity plans of the NGOs being put at the helm of any program implementation that they sign off with their partners and donors will be something that we think can be able to be helpful to the national NGOs' institutional capacity. And with that, we hope that this is something that can be put on the international agenda, especially by the donors, and really think. And that's what I was saying before, the donors at some point will have to really take the risk to see how best they can be able to build these capacities. It can be expensive for now, but in the near future, it can be quite helpful on how we can reduce in terms of funding and even the risk rating and analysis of national NGOs when it comes to implementation of programming. And that's my take on this kind of question for you. I hope I answered you aptly.
Thank you so much, Matt. It has been a very rich discussion so far. I will check with, I think we're at the end of the time. We are already over time. I think the best closure now would be just to ask Ruth and Fee what for them are the most important takeaways of this 1.5 debate about the nexus. Maybe you can share with us what you take away from this meeting. Besides that, we have to write a report and to make a video and to share all the comments in the chat box and the questions and answer box with Sherry, of course. Ruth and Fee, how do you feel about last 1.5 hour?
Okay, Fee, I'll start with you.
Well, I think lots of good comments. I personally, I really, demystifying the peace in the nexus is one big thing. Getting local actors involved in the discussions and really recognizing their capacities and reinforcing capacities that are not so strong, like Matt was suggesting, and really getting that into the paper and be risky in the paper as well, dare to take some providing some opportunities and dare to confront the traditional system thinking that we do see in our international humanitarian system. Over. Yeah,
and I think it was great to see some of your questions that haven't been able to be raised here, but we can take forward. So Lorenzo from EPLO had a really great question around whether military engagements can be even considered part of the nexus approach and under which conditions. I think there's a lot of really useful questions in there for thought on this paper and for us moving forward on the clarity around what we're including on this spectrum you've spoken about, and how then we're bringing localization and the role of local actors and communities into the discussion. I think there's been some really helpful comments from Marzia, from Martina as well, to really kind of clearly state how this can be done. Yeah, so I think, Sherry, you've been left with a lot of food for thought for your paper and also for our thinking as we go forward.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you both. We have lots of questions still open. I think we can choose like 4 or 5 max questions we can share with the speakers and ask them perhaps if they could take a look into it the coming days. There will be a final poll, so I hope you will take some time for the last questions. It will only take you 1 minute. I take home, the further you go into the field, the more those silos fall apart. That's maybe good to remember when we are having these kind of discussions. I really would like to thank Sherry. It was a very open and lively discussion, and thank you again for giving us this opportunity. I want to thank Matt Guy, Martina Zapf, Marzia Montemeo, and my co-hosts, of course, Rut Watson and Phil Laurensen. And I thank you all, and as soon as there is a report and a video, we will share it with all attendees. Bye-bye.